Hi folks, there's the advertisement going by. This is International Master John Watson. This show is called Ask the Master on ICC TV, and the idea of the show is to provide players with a forum for asking questions about chess and the chess world. So if you want to ask questions in advance, there are now 3 ways. In fact, you can ask them all week long, up to a few hours before the show. There are 3 good ways. First, I have a new email address, which is similar to the hashtag askimwatson@chessclub.com. I'll get to those right away. So that's askimwatson@chessclub.com if you prefer email to Twitter. We still have the Twitter channel. It's the hashtag askimwatson. Anytime you feel like it, you can send a tweet to askimwatson with a question for the show. And finally, you can send a message to my ICC handle John L. Watson, which is another way to reach me. But for right now, the alternative is to ask a question live right now during the show, which you can do on this page that you're watching at the right. You have to be registered in order to make comments. And if you aren't already registered to do so, you can start to type a comment in that box. That's the lower right-hand corner, that little box. The program will prompt you to register. It's very quick and easy, much easier than most registrations. And after that, you can log on and use the live chat. You don't need to be an ICC member to watch this show or to contribute to the chat channel or to send a question via Twitter or to send a question via email. So this is pretty much an open show. This is not really just for ICC members at all. And these shows will be shown on YouTube afterwards. You can ask about anything related to chess, and as I always say, there's a few areas in which I have some expertise. Chess openings, since I've played and written books and articles and talked about them for many, many years and taught them. Chess strategy, leading players, events in the chess world, chess books and videos, which we haven't gotten much. I'm a chess author. I haven't gotten many questions about books and videos, but I think those would be fun. And of course, you can ask anything that comes to mind. So let's start with this week's questions. We can either start with the chat room, or I will already, oh, here's one already from Captain K, and then I have a whole bunch that were sent to me during the week, which I will answer in time. We'll look at the Captain K12 first in the King's Indian. I sometimes play F5 to break down the center, but what if they stop me with G4? Well, that's a good general question. We're talking about the King's Indian defense. Many times G4 is quite a good move, actually. The usual way to meet G4 in most variations is probably to force your way through with F5 anyway. Sometimes you can just concentrate on the other side of the board. The good thing about the King's Indian is it's very flexible. So you can play, just for example, let's look at one of the main lines here. Or actually, let's look at something where G4 is probably going to happen. Something like this. And let's just say black brings his pieces out towards the center. And white will often develop. For example, here, black will attack that e-pawn, white will defend it. If you don't know these moves, you can look them up in a book, but they basically, what's going on is black is trying to put pressure on white's center, and his usual break is here, but he can also break on the queen side. He plays this first to stop b4. He might play c6, for example, if white plays this. Let's say white plays g4 right away. Black really has 2 approaches to this. One thing is to play, for example, this kind of move, and maybe even think about attacking on the queen side with that move and this move, and captures, and even b5 sometimes happens. It's actually a legitimate plan. The more obvious plan, and the one that most beginning King's Indian players play, is to move this knight somewhere and play for f5. And if white plays slowly, f5 is probably a good move right away. For example, let's say he goes here. That looks like a, well, that's almost too easy for black, but that's okay. Might as well show it. The idea of that move is to play very slowly to expel this powerful knight on f5, and what black does is immediately counters attacks. And so it turns out he hasn't really stopped that move. It's true that white can isolate, well, not isolate this one, he can win the e4 square for a piece, or try to. Now in this exact case, the rook is being attacked, so this might have been sort of a poor example. Let me start with a more neutral move, something like a3 or something. And black plays here, and white captures. Now white is trying to do this partly because it gives him the G file, and partly because he hopes to take over this square for a blockading square. But black is getting out really fast and is threatening knight here check. He's got an open file. He has moves like queen h4. Often white will stop that with h4. But basically this has all happened too quickly. And black can be very happy with this because knight d3 is a threat. e4 can't really be stopped, which opens up this strong bishop. Now usually white would like to already have that move in and maybe some other moves. Bishop up, he'd like to have a knight there, even the queen can get out, and then maybe castle queenside, or have already chased back this knight. So the answer is usually f5 is going to be the move, but white can also try to stop that. One way he does that in many cases is to do something involving, for example, maybe get these moves out first before, let me see, it's black's move. Just for example, this is a line that I actually kind of like for white, or I think is interesting for white. Just develop for a second before you play g4, and if black just starts developing, pretty soon you can throw this g4 in, and all of a sudden white's a little ahead of the game and has the knight better placed to meet f5. Let's see if I can give you an example here, just a sample little line. I don't know about castling queenside yet, I suppose you could do it. And f5, and in this case white has a new option, which is to put this knight here and put pressure on that square. And if black goes here, well, actually, that would be a good move. The timing has to be better here. Maybe f4 first. Oh, h4 first. That's a thought. Or even rook g1. Let's go rook g1, which discourages f5 because of the file. And then maybe castle. And if f5 takes, and knight g5 now, since that's protected by the rook now, so that if f4 you can take this. This would be pretty ideal for white because the knight has so much control over that square, which, by the way, coming right down the file, and white can get rid of his bad bishop. Remember that this bishop is bad because it's cut off by its own pawns. That leaves black with a bad bishop, cut off by its own pawns, and white with two very nice knights. And that square is becoming a big problem, just putting a knight or a bishop there. So this would be an attack for white. This is a case where the last case white played poorly and black got active play. Here black played poorly and white got active play. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. But you don't have to play f5. If you get this far, a good move is just c6. Maybe you're going to play a4 later, and you're going to try and do some things on the queen side. And white's got a lot to do too. But anyway, that's sort of an introduction to what some of the ideas are. Okay, I found this question asked on Twitter quite interesting. John Hartman at Jan R. Hartman. Also, what would be a good role model for the black side of the Maran? Yes, I saw this question too, and I was thinking about it. First of all, let's show you what the Maran is. There's some players that don't know that. That's part of the Slav defense. So the normal way to get to the Maran is a kind of semi-Slav. You can theoretically get to the semi-Slav by doing things like either this, which allows an interesting option for white, or this. And what are the problems with that? Well, that allows, for example, an exchange variation. A lot of times people as black don't like to do that. So the most popular way of getting to a semi-Slav is actually to play the Queen's Gambit declined, and then not allow this exchange variation, which can really bother people, but instead to play the triangle system. So knight f6 is still probably coming, but just not yet. And if white plays here, black has a choice between playing the no-to-boom variation, which has to do with playing this move b5, and the regular semi-Slav. Now we're in a semi-Slav, this structure here. And white can play very dynamically and vigorously with that move, but the Maran variation comes after here. And black develops usually there because it's the most flexible move. And white's main move has been this over the years. It's been played ever since the 1930s, a lot. It's a major, major opening in chess theory. And what black does, since he has less space, and this move is coming pretty soon, is he takes and expands on the queen side. It looks very artificial, but over the years it has held up very, very well. This is called the Maran. It's very dynamic. Black can play either bishop here, thinking about b4 and c5, or just a6 as Anand has done, or made popular, even though it was the original move and was played a long time ago. And then play here and play for c5 with dynamic play is the idea. Okay, now what about role models? I guess I would say let's look at the Meran exactly, which is, well, b5 is always played really. The obvious one is Vishy Anand, who's made a living off of this for years and years, played it in the World Championship, but has also just played it in countless major top games, and that's contemporary. So let me see if I wrote down any examples, but that would be the good person to look at, and probably the best because he's still playing it, so it's contemporary. Many of the lines of the Meran are very, very tactical because white's blasting through in the center while black is blasting through in the center too. So everything's sort of hanging. There's a lot of kingside attacks, and because of that, you might want to follow somebody who's very theoretical and knows things very exactly. Boris Gelfand is a player like that, who's played a lot of good Meran games. And many of the fundamental variations, especially the positional ones, were developed by Alexei Dreyev, who is still playing the Meran, but his earlier games are probably the most instructive because he sort of invented some of the new ideas. He specialized in this line, but he actually played a lot of different Meran lines. So those would be the three players that you could follow that I think are excellent prospects. So let's see what we have here. But let's be real, I'll never abandon my beloved Grunfeld. That's the person who asked the question. I don't believe that. I think he'll definitely get back to the other d-pawn openings as time goes on. Shirov has a lot of good Meran games too. Absolutely. I thought of mentioning him, but since those games tend to be a little older, they're very fundamental and they're very instructive. But the thing is, Shirov's games are so tactical and his openings are so tactical that there'll be improvements on a lot of those games. So if you want slightly more contemporary things that are more relevant to the theory, especially if you have to learn a lot of modern, very, very delicate tactical lines, but definitely it can't hurt you to look at Shirov at all. Let me just scroll up here a little bit. Let's see what we've got here. Okay, scroll up and down. Okay, good. Okay, so no more questions quite yet. Let me answer another one that came in through, actually this one came in through email of all things. Okay, Marius1 asks, what do you think is the most underrated ending to learn in its ability to win games or improve overall chess understanding? So I thought that instead of just mentioning underrated endings, I'd talk about what the most practical endings are for students. Now, for the players starting out, of course, you have to know your king and pawn endings, and you have to know your mates. You have to know how to mate. But once you've gotten past that stage, I think rook and pawn endgames are what you really need to know. Rook and pawn endgames show up more often than in other endings, and that's because the rooks tend not to be exchanged early. They're often the last piece out. Especially the minor pieces will get exchanged earlier. And the queens also, because they get out early and a lot of skirmishes, will tend to often be exchanged. And if the queens aren't exchanged, often you don't get to an ending because there's some sort of mating situation going on, or a lot of checks, or the queens are very dynamic pieces, and so often the game doesn't even go into an ending. So rook and pawn endgames are the most important endgames of the basic ones. And they're extraordinarily tricky, and they're very instructive, and they're also still badly played, not only by lower players, but even by the top players, because they're so confusing. But you will win more games because you understand rook and pawn endgames, or even know them by heart, than any other kind of ending. Now, as far as underrated endings, I was thinking about bishop versus knight endings, which are also ones you get all the time, and also two bishops versus two knights, and two bishops versus knight and bishop. And that's because I think very few average players really understand how much better the bishops are than the knights in the ending, unless the knight has a tremendous outpost, or unless all the pawns are on one side of the board. And most endings, there'll still be pawns on both sides of the board. Now, if there are only pawns on one side of the board, then the knights are sort of famously good. Not always better than the bishops, though. Bishops are awfully good pieces, even in that situation. But generally, it'll favor the knight to have pawns on one side of the board, because after all, they're more short-stepping pieces. But I would say that's the most underrated ending, and no one ever seems to study it. And it means a lot. It comes up an awful lot, but that's why it's important, and that's why it's a good practical weapon. So that's the answer to that. Let's see what we've got. What about Larson as a role model? For the Semi-Slav, I guess. I'm sure he'd be great. He's a role model for almost any opening. But once again, there's a question of the Semi-Slav tends to be so tactical that his variations might be somewhat dated, and you might and you better be careful at least not to follow them exactly, because you can get checkmated or fall into a bad game very easily just because of more modern analysis. But yeah, I mean, he'd be great to get the general ideas from. But this opening tends to be pretty dynamic, so the general ideas aren't always the key to whether you win or lose. Often it's just who knows the opening better and who knows the tactics better. So let me see, what was your best game ever? Well, I don't know. I actually have never really picked a best game, and it's certainly not of much interest. I played a couple really nice King's Indians where I sort of smashed through on the king side even when it looked like I really shouldn't be able to, with double sacrifices and things. That's a tough question. I mean, there's always the games where you beat someone really good. I remember there's a nice game in the French against Nick de Fermian. But usually the games where you beat somebody really are not your best because the person's putting up a lot of resistance and it's not so easy. Things don't flow so smoothly. But I can't think of any games that really stand out. If in your sharpen your chess sets repertoire you hadn't gone for the Trompowsky, what would you have then suggested against the Benoni? It's a very interesting question. But now 2 years later, let me see, they turned out to be the most concrete lines in my repertoire, but now 2 years later I haven't had a chance to use them yet, and I have to refresh them and felt kind of silly. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the rest of the question, which had scrolled down. 2 years ago I prepared some lines against the Benoni. They turned out to be the most concrete lines in my repertoire. Yeah, I mean, I would probably stick with the Bishop F4 lines. They're extremely popular at the top level, and they're relatively safe. You want to be a little careful with the Benoni. You can get kind of bowled over in the Benoni. So here's the Benoni defense, and he's talking about the modern Benoni, which is by far the most common one, which goes like this. And now you can play knight F3 or knight C3. Sometimes knight F3 is already in. So here's a Benoni. And yeah, Bishop F4 is a really nice line. There's actually quite a few. I play the Benoni, so I know that there's a lot of good lines against it. Very safe line is the G3. A lot of top GMs use that. And anything else tends to expose you a little bit, I suppose. A lot of people play this modern main line just because they think it's good for white. One disadvantage to the modern main line is this silly move. I'm sorry, usually H3 is in earlier than this to stop Bishop G4. There are a couple of problems. One is move order. You can't always get to this position. But the other one is this move, which white really has had trouble cracking. So that's, and I think I won't go into any detail there because that isn't really the question. I probably wouldn't play this. Also, there's lines that I recommend in my book on the Benoni and have been played a lot since then, which have to do with this move, either A6 first or this move, and then playing this strange move knight here. And that's a very dynamic line. Even if white thinks he's better, it's still very dynamic and takes a lot of things. You have to learn a lot, and you can get in trouble. The line he's probably talking about is either Bishop F4 immediately or one move later. Probably one move later. Well, it's a little more common these days, partly because knight F3 is often already in. And the idea is that if black now there's two moves really. One is this, but then it's hard for black to get play on the queen side. But this is a common way to play to avoid what I'm about to show you. The other is this one, which I still think is very fun. And white can play this clever little maneuver with check. Now, if black puts a piece on this square, he's going to lose the D pawn unless he plays bishop here, attacking the queen. And now the queen comes back, attacking here. And this can be a little bit awkward. I don't know if we want to do a lot of preparation, a lot of explanation of this, but I know a lot about this position. I've studied it for years and years and years. There's some funny sacrifices. You can either just defend this, which is considered inferior, but I think actually it's better than its reputation. I've played it. I think it's quite a bit better than its reputation, actually. Or you can sacrifice a pawn with this kind of move and then start attacking. That's kind of a crazy line. White's supposed to be theoretically better, but recently black's tried it a bit more. I notice in the chess publishing columns where they analyze these things to death, white still seems to be a little bit better. But you have to learn. So you have to learn these lines, especially this one. You have to learn these sacrificial lines. That's a bit of a problem. And of course you have to learn what to do against this, but that's a lot easier because it's so solid. In fact, you can always go back to, okay, the other bishop f4 line that you might be talking about, which is very simple to play, is to play a move like h3, and then play a move like e3, and just get your pieces out, and ask black how he's going to counter your space advantage. This was a very, well, still is, I think, an irritating line to play against. You'll see this in Grandmaster play a lot. Black can try to play for this move knight, for those of you who want to be black, play for this move knight e4. And if white tries to stop that, which is often considered best, he can kind of insist on trying to get knight there. And things can get extremely tactical here. There could be all kinds of crazy ideas. Sometimes, by the way, these moves are in first, these two moves. a6 threatens b5, which is so difficult for black to counter on the queen side that white will almost always stop it. Let me just show you that, even though I think you can play bishop f5 without these moves, but that's the trade-off. White really doesn't want to allow this, and he loves winning a little more space on the queen side. And this can get really crazy. Just for example, white can play some moves like, let me see if I can get this right. I can play some moves like, is it knight c4 immediately? Yeah, I suppose so. Knight here, protecting that. This is attacked twice. Takes here. Now the idea is neither piece can take there, because if the bishop takes here, we have rook takes. Notice that's hanging too, and rook b4 is a move, and the bishop's hanging. Or if the knight takes, then we have this move, rook takes f4, winning this piece. So this is a fascinating position because white can simply attack that or attack here, and this can get really crazy. Something like this, attacking the rook. If white gets really ambitious, there's this problem with queen here check. And I won't show you, there's some incredible details here for black. He starts sacrificing all his pieces. But so that's a fascinating line. This player Gera book beat Kamsky on the black side of this position. So that's kind of fascinating. Okay, that's enough. I've gone way back. But the answer, I guess, is I would look at bishop f4 again. Or maybe g3 if you want to be really safe and be sure that you're not going to get a disadvantage. That's a good line, very solid line. Probably not actually advantageous if black plays perfectly, but what is really? All right, okay, let's forget the previous questions from other weeks for a moment because we're getting some new ones. And the Caro Kann, is it good to pawn storm on the bishop? That's awfully general. There are many ways to do that in the Caro Kann, so I'm not sure which line. In fact, it's amazing how many lines you can do that in, but probably the most famous line, there's many of them. In this variation, here goes that bishop, that's the one he's talking about. A traditional line, traditional, it's kind of modern, but it's traditional in the sense it's been around for 30 years now, is to play there followed by g4. So you get this position a lot. And is that good? Well, it won a lot of games, and but how good it is, I'm not sure. I think black's fairly satisfied with this. You can also play it very early. You can play, well, for example, last week I think we looked at playing h4, and the idea was g4, and this is considered to be white's best move, actually. And what other g4s are there? Well, there's also a sort of a pawn storm in the main line, which goes like this. And now white will very often play this move. It's sort of a pawn stormy kind of thing. But really it's only one pawn that's coming up, so maybe. But still, you're advancing with those pawns on the king side. g4 is the main pawn storm move, and there's 4 or 5 other ways to play g4 in the Caro Kann, but I don't think I'll go into that. It's an awfully general question. So maybe we can stop there with that one. Okay, let me try and keep going with ones that people sent during the week because they deserve an answer if they can get it. Here's a question: how about the Pseudo-Trompowsky? So here's the Trompowsky that was mentioned earlier. I'm sorry, here's the Trompowsky which was mentioned earlier. And when this is, I mentioned this in my repertoire. I gave a little repertoire with this move, and the earlier question referred to this, saying that White had switched to this move in this position, but then his older repertoire was with this, and he was interested in what to do against the Benoni, which was that. That's what we just talked about. Now there's something called the Pseudo-Trompowsky, which is where you insist on playing bishop g5 and getting into a sort of irregular position anyway, and this is much less popular. And in my opinion, it's not less popular because of the obvious move, which is okay for black, but not, chasing the bishop, for example. It's certainly okay for black. But I think the reason that this isn't played more, and it's the reason I was always happy to play against it, was this move. And now, usually white plays here. It's natural, right? Because if black plays here, now that pawn is pinned for the recapture. It also makes sense because why would the bishop retreat, having already gone out there? Some people have played this move on the grounds that that might be a weakness. And I think that it's actually a useful move, and so therefore this move, bishop f4, isn't really all that great. The idea is you go into a Chigorin-like position now, the Chigorin's defense to the queen's gambit with knight c6. And if white plays there, you can make moves like this. This is a standard line. This is an exact book position, except the pawn isn't on f6. And you can take advantage of that pawn being on f6 by getting the move e5 in. I mean, you could play it right now. Maybe white shouldn't have played e3, but you can also play there, castles, and then e5, even as a pawn sacrifice if necessary, although usually it isn't. This is a line that Nigel Davies suggested in the old days in the Chigorin. And some other players also suggested this. It's an old line. And that would be this way. That would be with the move here, and this version of the Chigorin where white delays or even doesn't play c4. So that would go like this, and now this move has been suggested and played a fair amount. And there we are, a whole tempo up. Now it's black's move again in our line with the Pseudo-Trompowsky. So that explains why, even though f6 looks like a weakness, it really isn't. So white usually goes back, and now this move is very nice. We had this in our book 30 or 35 years ago, and now all of a sudden it's in a lot of things. I think there was an article even just recently in Secrets of, actually it was in the Bosch article on opening surprises, the SOS articles. So the idea is to play here, and the bishop doesn't have anywhere to go, and if you can exchange it off, you have two bishops without any serious weaknesses. And it's hard to prevent knight f5, isn't it? So that's an issue. And knight f5 also attacks the center. So you have moves like e5, c5, knight c6. And in fact, white really should play this move. I don't think there's any other. He really should save his bishop. And then a good move is here with a really quick e5 to follow, and maybe knight here soon. But you can look into this, but I think white's already kind of struggling. White needs to work hard to maintain equality here. And in my opinion, people who know about this knight f6 move, this is the reason that the Pseudo-Trompowsky isn't as good as the regular Trompowsky. Just my opinion. There are other ways to play against the Pseudo-Trompowsky, obviously. Okay. It's actually put out by New in Chess, exactly. This was, Shock 2 mentions that this line was put out, that this line, the article is in New in Chess magazine, the SOS article, and then it comes out in a separate volume, often. Okay, John, what do you think of the Sicilian Kalashnikov? Why is it not played at a high GM level? I think it's played at a pretty high GM level, more than it used to be. I have to plead ignorance here. I just don't really know these lines very well at all. It used to be that it was considered inferior to the Sveshnikov. The Sveshnikov being this. A lot of people are probably familiar with this. Many books have been written about this. Now, there have been several books on the Kalashnikov, even going way back. Now, this is the Sveshnikov, and it has very similar ideas to the Kalashnikov. The difference is white can't play the move c4. In the Kalashnikov, we have the immediate move here. Now, in the old days, there was something called the Lowenthal variation, where black would play here. I always thought this was slightly underrated for black. And white has a bunch of moves here. Here, I used to play this move. You can play right back. They're considered the best theoretical move is actually going straight back and trying to use the d5 square. Or you can take, and the takes is, even though it looks like black has a huge lead in development, this has turned out to be not trivial. In fact, I think Kaufman, in his Anand series, recommends this for black. I think, for white. I think black's okay, but he has to play really accurately. Okay, that's the Leventhal. I'm getting way off the subject, but interesting. Maybe people would like to know that because it used to be played a lot more than now. And here's the Kalashnikov. And the difference is that white could play here. Whoops. But now black has this move a6 immediately because there's no knight d6 check. So white sometimes wants to play this move to really clamp down on that d5 square. But black can play this way anyway, and does all the time. He plays moves like knight f6 and bishop e6 and chases the knight back. And the answer to the question is quite a few decent players are playing the Kalashnikov. There's a recent book on it, as there's always a recent book on everything, but I think it's a very respectable book and probably reflects the fact that the Kalashnikov is at least playable. It's a good question. You know, actually, top players aren't even playing the Sveshnikov much anymore. The Sveshnikov for a long time was considered a kind of a drawing line for black. It's not obvious right now, but a lot of lines would end up in opposite colored bishops. No, it's hard to believe, but Kramnik made a living off of drawing games as black, which he does anyway with all his openings, by getting opposite colored bishops. That sounds very obscure, but I'd have to show you some long, long lines, and that's not worth it. So the Kalashnikov is probably played just as much as the Sveshnikov now, I think, but not at the top levels. He's right. Maybe white just doesn't want to get that. Black doesn't want to get that positional disadvantage with the pawn on c4, regardless of what the theory says. Let's see. Is there a further chat about that? There are a lot of variations, obviously, but not really. Oh, he does a good job of explaining the ideas. Let me see who that is. Marin's repertoire. Here we go. You've studied Marin's rep. Is it difficult to handle? That's a question between chat participants here. Mr. Fartbrains says there are a lot of variations, obviously, but he does a really good job of explaining. Now, who is this that explains that? I think I missed that. At any rate, there is a book recently, and I don't think there are that many variations compared to a lot of the Sicilians. In fact, it's a very positional opening. So actually, you can play the Kalashnikov a lot more easily than you can play most of the other Sicilian variations. There are very few direct mating attempts to do mating attacks by white. So offhand, I don't think that's true. I think the variations are very positional and slow, and there aren't that many critical lines, so it's actually a lot easier to learn. Okay, why do you like the Nimzo-Indian so much? Osman, okay. What were the two top best chess games? Well, okay, the Nimzo-Indian is this, of course. I don't play it myself very much. I have played it. Actually, I've played it several times. Oh, I had one of my best games was a Nimzo-Indian, but unfortunately I messed it up at the end and I only drew. That was, talk about best games, that was one of my favorites. But this is the Nimzo-Indian, and we talked about it quite a bit. We talked about all of white's possible moves here. If you go back to look at YouTube, or the previous shows, you'll see that we talked about a lot of white's options here, and I recommended this for white. Well, I guess the Nimzo-Indian is fun because you develop so quickly. A lot of lines you castle, you play c5, d5, you just blast open the center and get all your pieces out. The disadvantage is you usually give up your bishop for a knight, but you get in big lead in development in doing so. So you can go back and look at earlier lectures for that. Again, extremely general question. Depends what you like to call the best. Yes. The clearest beatdown. Most brilliancy shown by a player. Well, of course, Kasparov has a lot of brilliant games. I could show you one of the most famous games by Kasparov, which everybody had seen for a while, but now is getting a little older, so who knows, is his game against Topalov, where he's white in a Pierce defense, and that's a game that everybody should know. Possibly the most brilliant game ever, certainly in a I think, for example, here at Morphy's game, simply brilliant, and that's actually true, but I think that modern games are a little more complex and have more resistance. A lot of Morphy's games, there wasn't much resistance. The opponent didn't play, and that's not Morphy's fault, but the opponent didn't play as well as, for example, Topalov did in this wonderful Kasparov game. There are so many brilliancies now. I don't know if anybody's recently seen the kid Y.E. is playing great. Mamedyarov has had some wonderful brilliancies. Shirov has one after another. I think there are more modern brilliancies that are actually better than a lot of the classic brilliancies, but the problem is there's so many of them that they don't stand out, and they aren't in all the history books, all these great brilliancies. So I don't know So maybe I'll do that for one of the future shows, show a lot of brilliant games, but I think for right now I'd have to look them up and make sure I got every move right. Yeah, Morphy's games are wonderful, and it's a good way to start out chess because they're very clear, these brilliancies. A lot of times, as I say, black is making fairly obvious moves, and that really helps to show a brilliancy because you can see the ideas so clearly. But okay, let's go to another question. That was the Pseudo-Trompowsky. Captain K12, who is on this, Captain K12, who is on this chat channel right now, asks, what is the Blackmar-Diemer opening? A lot of you probably know this, but the Blackmar-Diemer involves a gambit. Now you can play knight c3 first. Whoops. But if you do, for example, this position, you have to deal with the move knight takes e4, and you'll understand that in 1 second when I show you what the Blackmar-Diemer is. The Blackmar-Diemer is playing this first. It's a gambit. It's called the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. Black wins a pawn. White attacks the pawn back because f3 is not a very good move. Black defends it, and then white gambits another, makes his gambit permanent, because if black takes that, then white's a pawn down and won't get it back for a long time. The idea is that he has extra development, an open file. He can bring his pieces out really quickly. All of his pieces might go to the might go queenside. It's very, very active, and the idea is to get a lot of attack. Over the years, it's become less and less popular because such good solutions have been found. Maybe you'd like to see a few fairly easy solutions. Here's one that's kind of cute. It's here. I think it's called the O'Kelly variation. Now, white doesn't have much better than taking back. That was his whole idea of playing f3, was to get a big center. And then black counterattacks here. And this is kind of cute because this move runs into this, and then however he takes it back, I suppose knight takes probably a little bit better. Then black plays here, and he's going to get this pawn back. He also has ideas of bringing the bishop to kind of aggressive squares. And this kind of position is very nice. Actually, here, I'm sorry, you can play here. So this is my fault, excuse me. That's why he takes with the king. I was sort of wondering for a second. Okay, this is a double attack, so he really gets his pawn back. He's threatening here and here. And when the king goes back, let's say, to defend there, black takes here. And you might wonder, well, why is black so happy here? Well, this is an isolated pawn on an open file with an outpost square that's already occupied right in front of it. And a lot of other pieces can occupy that outpost square, so you can't really get rid of a piece on that square. A rook can come over too. And these kind of things with the e-pawn at target are extremely difficult to defend. So black's already better after just 8 moves here. So that's a nice thing. Now white probably wouldn't take that, but if he doesn't take that, he's got this problem, which is that's an isolated pawn anyway. It's isolated, and there's an outpost right in front of it that can cause all kinds of problems. So I think black's already better here too, and that's a good solution. Now there are other ways to play. Probably white doesn't take here, but I am not going to go into too much detail. The other way you can play it is very similar. You can play here, here, and say, look, I'm just a pawn up, and I'm going to play very solidly. And I'm going to put my bishop either here or here. Now you have to be a little careful, because if you try to pin this guy, then white has a couple different tricks here, but the best trick is probably just directly to play here, threatening this twice, and if bishop takes queen, there's a mate. So watch out for that trick, a very common trick in the opening, in various openings. You could also play check first, but I think it's better to play here first. It might even just win almost by force. Because if black goes back to defend that checkmate, then of course there's this move. And then that wins a whole piece, because if black recaptures, white has the checkmate again. So I should get rid of my sounds here. But we don't have to worry about that too much. There aren't going to be a lot of checkmates. What else? Is there another defense? I guess bishop here, but then you can imagine how horrible it is. This bishop just isn't getting out. That's very weak. And this kind of position is well known to be very, very good for white. So that's a little trick. But what black does is just goes there, gets his bishop out in front of what's going to be his pawn chain here, and it turns out that white, has various tries, but simply doesn't have enough for a pawn. That's the Blackmar-Diemer. I'm not so sure, Captain 1-2, that NN, which means anonymous opponents, Anderson and Paulson, were not defending well. Well, we'll just disagree on that. They're defending maybe well, they're strong players, but nothing like modern resistance to some of these attacks. Most amateurs don't defend well either, that's true. Yeah, NN usually means amateur. NN stands for anonymous, so Morphy played a lot of anonymous games against anonymous players, and they tended to be pretty weak. Not always. Sometimes it turned out they were pretty good players. Hi, does the accelerated dragon variation in the Sicilian defense get much love these days? Not at the very top, and I have no idea why. I guess people just don't want to play against the Maroczy bind. My friend John Donaldson had an amazing record with the accelerated fianchetto for many years. Jeremy Silman, also another friend of mine, played it a lot. In fact, they collaborated on a book and also just collaborated generally. Now here's the dragon variation. And it's also not tremendously popular these days. That's this move. Even though it still seems to hold up very well theoretically. If you read Chris Ward's column in Chess Publishing, for example, every month he shows all the latest dragons. My friend Keaton Kira plays the dragon very successfully against the very top players. He's only an IM, but he does extremely well. The accelerated fianchetto, the dragon does have some issues that I don't know if you get an advantage against it, but you have to learn a lot, and there's some tricky lines that are maybe slightly awkward. But the accelerated fianchetto tries to save a move on the dragon. This is the accelerated fianchetto here. It's very similar to the dragon. And for example, if white plays here, it can transpose after moves like, I'm not going to show you all the deviations here, but if moves like that, and then if black plays here, we're back in a normal dragon position. But black doesn't have to play that way. He can play for the move d5 in one shot. And that's what makes it different. For example, if white plays there, which is one of the anti-dragon lines, black might play an early d5 instead of d6, and this frees his game. That's one of the ideas of the accelerated fianchetto. Now, white has options, which is to play bishop c4, and that can often transpose into a normal dragon. And white also has a major option, which is to play here. Whoops, excuse me. And that's called the Maroczy bind. And just like the Kalashnikov, it really ties down on that square. It makes it difficult for black to free his game with the move d5. And you can see that, for example, these are not forced moves at all. In fact, it's not even the main line anymore, probably. But you can see that white's knight is more comfortable here with the pawn also supporting d5. For example, black can't play a6 and b5 and b4 attacking that knight. So white has space, and his pieces are coming out almost as fast as black's, and he can be comfortable. Now, John Donaldson, for example, for years and years drew top GMs as black because he knew specific variations where he could simplify and get the right kind of position. But you have to know it very, very well. It may be now that white's considered slightly better in these lines, and that's why top players tend not to give up space, even in lines that theory says it's kind of okay to give up. One thing I don't like about the accelerated fianchetto is this line, because I've played it sort of as black with reverse colors, where it's called the Rubinstein variation. I think it's a good weapon for white. There's no when black plays here, for example, white plays here, and there's no exchanges on that square. It's very popular to exchange on that square. And you've got a tempo up on an anti-Sicilian position that has a lot of dynamic possibilities. This is a fun opening to play for white, I think. I recommended it in one of the old Beat the Sicilian books. Not Beat the Sicilian, that was anyway, the quality chess book against the Sicilian. Beat the Sicilian was maybe the title of the nun books on the white side of the Sicilian. Anyway, it's not a full answer. I guess the Maroczy bind would be my answer. That's the one that people worry about most. Top players, very top players. Very good question. I don't know. I know there are quite a few masters and IMs that still play the accelerated fianchetto and are perfectly happy with it. So there's also one other issue. I know. Okay, here's a point. A lot of people these days don't want to play against bishop e5. Yeah, I should mention this. So a lot of people don't like this position, and the other way of trying to get into the accelerated fianchetto is this way. But then you have two choices. You can either take, and you have to put up with these lines, attacking the rook. They're extremely complicated and theoretical. And if you don't take, you have to put up with ideas like this or d5. So it's hard to get to the accelerated fianchetto. Maybe that's one of the answers here that I kind of forgot about, because there's an awful lot of people that simply don't want to play this position these days for black, even though I suppose if you really know what you're doing, you're okay here. It's called the Rossolimo for white, and it's extremely popular for white. So I think I actually, maybe that's even a better answer. They simply can't get to the accelerated fianchetto without paying a price in terms of other lines occurring. Okay, so let's see. Great question. Always, you guys, such good questions. That question was from Nice Neezy, by the way. I should mention who's asking all these questions. But Lasker, Stein is doing well anyway. Something about who's defending well and who isn't. I think all the modern players are defending much better than the people who played Morphy. I just started, which is natural. The chess players are better than they were in that day. I just started playing the Petroff. Any tricky sidelines I need to be aware of? Hey, I'll show you something that I liked as that's McFartbrains again. I doubt if anybody's able to play this against you, but I just love this line here. And black, really, these are black's only real moves here. And then in two different books, I've recommended playing that move. And you can also play crazy little moves like this, but they aren't maybe as dangerous. I think c4 is underrated. The idea is to play knight c3, and then when black takes, to take here with more control of d5 and very fast development, getting your pieces out very quickly, and then putting a rook on the d file too. I don't know if I'm going to go into any details here, because there's always a question of time. So I think maybe I'll skip the details here so we can get to other questions. But you can look into this. Just real quickly, if he plays something, let's just say something like that, goes there, and if he does take, it goes here. The idea is just to set up your pieces aggressively. I'm cheating here because these are not really the best moves, but you get the idea. And then if you castle queenside, you've got pressure on this. That's not even probably as correct, but it's close enough. It shows the ideas. The other idea is to get the pieces out really quickly and start aiming at the king side. And it's surprising how good white's attack can be. You could weaken black's position with there and then castle queenside. That's probably a better setup, actually. And c6 obviously isn't the only move. Black has 4 or 5 moves there. I tend to think white's actually a little better in that line, but obviously people disagree because they hardly ever play it. What other tricky sidelines? I'm trying to think. Cyrus Lakdawalla just wrote a huge book on the Petroffs. You might want to get that book and take a look at it. He's got a repertoire for black, obviously, or shows how black can play every line. So you might want to take a look at that. Experts versus Sicilian. Thank you very much. That's what that was called. There were 2 editions at least of it. Very good. Grimsy64 says that. Okay, one more Twitter question. I want to get through some of the questions. Otherwise, every week there'll be more of them piling up. Well, here's a general question. I'm probably answering too many opening questions. What happened to chess in China? 20 years ago, there were no, this is Marius 1. 20 years ago, there were no top players, and now it looks like they're on their way to world domination, question mark. So my understanding, especially from various books and articles, is that in China they set up a very specialized program where they took really very few talented kids and built them up to develop extremely strong players. They imported a lot of coaches from abroad, maybe a lot of Russian coaches. And so at first there were just a few targeted talents, and there wasn't really a mass following for the game. This is my impression anyway. But now the game is becoming generally more popular, probably because some of their top players are becoming heroes. And so it's a very unusual approach. It's sort of a top-down approach. But of course it's a country without a chess tradition, so that's almost a natural kind of approach to take. And of course the government is involved and is naturally set up to do top-down approaches. So who are these Chinese players you might be interested in? Well, for one thing, Hu Yifan has been world champion for some years now and is the strongest, at least in rating, the strongest women's player in the world. I think she's passed Judith Polgar. She might have slipped back again, but arguably the strongest player, at least on a temporary basis in history. Although Judith Polgar would be the greatest player in history still, but Hu Yifan has had an amazing career and has had other women's world champions. And China now has 7, I looked up, of the top 40 players in the live chess ratings list. That's a lot. With Ding Liren as number 8, he's the top one, but they're all very strong. And I noticed that in the past few days in the Millionaires chess, which you may have been looking at on ICC, Yu Yangyi qualified for the semifinals, and Kwam Liam Lee won some big matches against strong players on the way to the last stage. And of course, Wai Li, we've talked about already, the kid who is some consider the possible successor to Magnus Carlsen. So, I mean, China's all set to win a chess Olympiad at some point here. They've come fairly close, and it wouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, there's tremendous competition. There's other good countries, but they're arguably as good as anybody right now. So we'll see what happens in the future there. Okay, let's go back to this. Is Alekhine defense viable or just goofy? Another Cyrus Lactawala book. I know he had success. Yeah, that's a long time ago. I wouldn't say it's goofy. I wrote the column for the Alekhine defense in the Chess Publishing for a while, and let me just see this for a second. Let's go back. This is the Alekhine's defense, and I didn't find anything that horribly wrong with it. Oddly enough, the 4 pawns attack, which is something that doesn't seem to work against, this throwing pawns forward doesn't work against very many openings. This is actually a tough system, but White has to learn a massive amount of theory, and there's all kinds of fun and attractive. I played the Alekhines, by the way, for years, so I kind of like it in a lot of ways. The main line with this, the main traditional line, one thing that's happened, I think, is that this has been somewhat revived. I showed Cyrus a particular line against this that I think is very interesting for black. My feeling is the Alekhines is relatively sound. The way Carlsen and some of those guys played it was to take and play c6, which is really boring, in my opinion, but possibly is holding on. I feel like White's better in these lines, and I think that's why the top guys were playing the Alekhines really briefly, and then they sort of stopped, and I think they stopped because this line, which is the line they were all playing, gives White a small advantage and isn't much fun. Isn't very, there are better ways to play solidly as black. But I think you could, if you're going to play it actively. Play right into the main lines, and I think this main line is more interesting than this main line, although they're both quite playable. So, oh, here we go. I meant the 4 pawns variation. Meant the 4 pawns variation maybe for White. I think the 4 pawns variation is quite sound and interesting, and most of the lines can be improved for White. Most of the traditional solutions can be improved by White. So I guess in theory, well, this is a huge challenge to the Alekhines defense, but there's a lot of things to do. This has become very popular, this idea of just playing g6, and that's a pretty good way to play against it. I mean, I don't know what the exact theory is right now. At the time I was writing in the column, I thought White had some tiny advantage after a long sequence, but tie for answering. Anyway, so let's see, any more questions here? Did I miss anything on the way up? Let me just see if I missed anything on the way up. Cool, I hadn't heard of the book. Yeah, there aren't that many books on the Alekhine, but I think Cyrus is pretty good, and you can go back and look at the old classics. I think it's going too far back to look at what Eels and Williams and Bagirov, which are the really old ones, although they had wonderful ideas in them. What are other books on the Alekhines? That's actually a good question. I'm not sure. I feel like I'm missing something obvious. I mean, some years ago, Graham Burgess wrote a book on Alekhines and then updated it with a sort of supplementary book. But that was a long time ago. So basically what you'd have to do is look at the top players that play it, and there are some, well, meaning at least some lower GMs and some IMs, and see what they're doing. Baburin is probably one of the best known Alekhines players, and played great games with it, and has had tremendous luck with it. He would play Alekhines when everybody knew he was going to play it, these top players, and he would get good games anyway, so that's always a good sign. Okay, we're headed towards the end here. Here's one. Ken Case asks, Mark Blivenstein has written about the line, here, the French defense, here. Okay, takes, knight f6, bishop f3. You've briefly discussed this line in your French books. Does it have much merit other than surprise value? Well, I think it's rather slow. I think it gives up the advantage for White. I think White can't possibly stand worse. It's a nice place for the bishop. Probably better than this. This is already immediately equal for Black, and actually Black even maybe has a little pressure on the center. So I like bishop f3 a lot better. It keeps it on this nice long diagonal. But after all, Black's already tied up, it's already caught up in development. So that's a very good sign. And one of the clearest solutions is to play here. And then the best move is here, because c3 is just a little passive because Black gets an early e5 in. And now Black can just take this. It's not bad at all. If there, he can play a number of moves. Maybe bishop c5 is one of the better moves. So that's probably an interesting way to immediately equalize. Black has this 4 against 3, which is very nice in a lot of endings. It's a good example of how modern chess is so different. People really work hard. They get way behind in development just to get 4 against 3, even though that's a queenside majority, which people used to think was good. And that's not really true. The central majority is actually better in this case. And if queen takes, you can either take the queens off or maybe try to keep some pieces on. Play either bishop here or maybe bishop here and play knight c6 with tempo, regardless. Well, I mean, I guess you could take it, but that's not very attractive, having already moved the bishop 3 times. So that can be played. The more main line is this, and then almost no matter what white does, you're going to end up playing this. For example, here you're just going to play this move and attack in the center. White is for sure able to equalize in these positions. He can play bishop e3 instead of c3, like here. And but this is well known to be completely equal. So the question is, can white play a sort of a passive line and be equal in the opening? And of course he can. And you might want to play it. I mean, it's fairly interesting. You get a game, you get some pieces out, but it doesn't scare anybody, I would say. All right, what have we got here?